Hello and welcome to ClockTower Game Studios. Today we're going to talk very explicitly about S.E.E.R. It's a little bit of a change of plan. The original plan was to talk more about painting a model, but I didn't quite get that finished the way I wanted to, and it's sort of a model swap project, and I wanted to have it finished and shipped before I posted the video. So since that wasn't going to happen, and some other things have come up recently, I've been kind of introduced to a new gaming community, and some questions were asked regarding the game itself, so I wanted to cover that in a lot more detail and more specifically. We have talked about it previously, including some of the base rules, such as faction and roster creation. We went into a pretty good walkthrough of how to do that for some Daughters of the Burning Rose models, I believe. But this time we're going to talk just about the rules and about the game and about the plans around the game. Of course, the first question to ask is, what is S.E.E.R? Well, S.E.E.R is a generic or agnostic rule set for playing a tabletop skirmish wargame. What that means is that it's a small model count. Usually, rosters will contain between 5 and 7-ish models, so a really low model count. It also means that as a skirmish game, it's going to include more tabletop RPG elements like skill tests for jumping over barriers and stuff like that. So that's a couple things to keep in mind. If you're looking for a pure war game, this probably isn't for you. If you're looking for an RPG, this also isn't for you. But if you're experienced in both of those realms and you're looking for something that kind of is a best of both worlds, more combat oriented than just an RPG, but also more gritty than just a war game, this is where you want to be. So S.E.E.R stands for Skirmish Encounter Elementary Rules, meaning that it's supposed to be an intuitive, crunchy rules set for playing a skirmish encounter. It's an agnostic game, which means it can be played with any miniatures from any range, any company you like, as long as the scale's between 28 to 32 millimeter generally. You can play with bigger models. You can play with smaller models down to around 25 millimeter, and as high as, I suppose you could go all the way up to like 75 mil, but you'd have to really work at it. That said, it is possible, so it's something to keep in mind. If you find models you really like from those ranges, then you can probably work with them. What that means is that if you already own models from any game like Bolt Action, Warhammer 40K, Bushido, any of a number of different war games, you can play this game without having to buy much besides the rules. On the other end of it, because it's any models you want from anywhere you want, and as open to genre and type as you want, you can also buy whatever you want and get in as cheaply as possible. So that's what makes S.E.E.R great for new players and veteran players. It's cheap entry level. If you want it to be cheap, it can be cheap. We had one playtester that really focused on playing for just as low cost as he could, to the point where he was using the sort of big, they would have been close to like 45 millimeter scale, 75 millimeter scale green plastic army men. He used those very extensively in playtesting, and they worked great. Obviously, you know, that's the bottom of the barrel, as cheap as you can get. You just have to buy a bag of those soldiers and the rules. On the other hand, if you want to go through a boutique type model company like Cyborg Monstrous Miniatures, where each model is going to cost you like 30, 40 bucks, or if you want to go through like Forge World by Games Workshop for their high-end resin models, you can pay as much as you want per model and still play the game. So it can be as cheap or as expensive as you want to make it. We do, with that in mind, we do have some model companies that have been gracious enough to let us use their models. Of those, we've worked very extensively with Anvil Industries, Bombshell Miniatures. We've recently started working with Lion Tower Miniatures and Gammock Miniatures. And of course, we also work with Ramshackle Games and Scotia Grindle Productions. All those can be found on our website. They're linked from our Support Us page. They're great companies. They all have different highs and pros and cons. We talk about those in some other depth in the previous Tea & Talk video about S.E.E.R. So if you want more specific about each of those, check out our website, check out their websites, which I'll put in the description, and check out the previous Tea & Talk video, which I will put the link for up chair. So talking about the setting for S.E.E.R, it's sort of this weird mix mash of things where you've got access to fantasy elements, high sci-fi elements, and anything and everything in between. Alien civilizations, ancient historical type things. So how do you justify all that? Well, the way we've justified it to a degree is based on an event called the merging in the ancient past of the galaxy. So what has happened at this point in the merging is two separate planes of existence collided, causing the same galaxy from two different timelines to overlap and combine. So this, of course, would cause huge amounts of upheaval. The main setting, sort of the point of view we're telling it from, is the Galaxy A, which had a galaxy-spanning empire that was sort of a sci-fi setting. And then the second plane of existence crashed into it and sundered it. So with the empire's collapse and the introduction of all these crazy aliens that hadn't been seen before and everything else, the whole thing collapses. Pockets of humanity get stuck and stranded and isolated as planets are destroyed, cut off, lines of communication are cut. And so it sort of integrates everything. And then you'll have some places where as the two planes of existence collided, the same planet may have existed in both planes, and now you have this planet that was home to a sci-fi colony where, you know, aliens had landed and inhabited the planet. Well, suddenly they're coexisting or trying to coexist with whatever primitive society happened to appear on that planet at the time of the merging. So that's kind of how this all takes place and how it all overlaps. We're going to try and tell the story of the setting from the perspective of a couple of characters that are interacting with sort of a, for lack of a better word at the moment, a historical society based on trying to combine and figure out the exact history of the ancient past and the merging and how all of this ties together and interacts. So that's kind of what the setting is about and how it all ties everything together. So the next thing to talk about is the system for S.E.E.R itself and what all that entails as far as the actual mechanics of the game. So first of all, S.E.E.R is based on a D10 system, meaning that similar to Dungeons and Dragons is based on a D20 and everything you roll is determined by the results of that plus your stats or whatever else. S.E.E.R works similarly but with a D10 as the base. So that's kind of where we're at with that. The D10 roll plus whatever relative ability, you either meet or exceed a target number. If you do, you succeed. If you don't, you fail. There's also a system for exploding criticals on successes and a system for failure on the negative side. So there are critical failures and successes. It's a D10 based system that also features an exploding critical success for some rolls. Also featured are skill tests and ability tests, where the same thing, where as opposed to just pure combat, you also have to make skill checks for some things, again, such as, you know, jumping over large gaps, to clear obstacles, to climb things, and sometimes to interact with the environment, which brings us to another unique feature of S.E.E.R, which is there are systems in place so you can interact with the environment, lock doors, chain things shut, that sort of thing. So that also helps make S.E.E.R a little bit different from the standard wargaming fare. Another thing that makes S.E.E.R different than most other war games is the initiative system. So as opposed to being turn-based, where player A takes their entire turn, moves all their models, then player B goes, instead you have an initiative count based on the model's individual initiative stat, and it counts down from 10. And so if the model has an initiative of 5, then it would go on the initiative 5 step as you count down from 10. So there are going to be ties at times, and in which case player A and player B will roll off. If player A wins and has more models than player B, then it'll be turn-based almost in that, just in that initiative step. So let's say player A has 3 models, player B has 2. Player A wins the roll-off. Player A would take 1 activation with one of his models, player B would take 1, and they'd take turns until all the models were run out. And then it would move on to the next initiative step. Another thing that makes S.E.E.R different from some other war games is that instead of using the D10, which is the core of the system for all of the damage rolls and everything else, the damage dice are determined by the weapons used and special rules that go with them. So that's one other way that it differentiates towards an RPG as opposed to just a standard war game. Of course, with the rules being so wide open, balance is really important to maintain. Especially considering we're talking about taking fantasy, high Renaissance historical minis with little to, some magic and stuff like that up against super sci-fi soldiers and powered armor with laser weapons and anything and everything in between. So balance is definitely a concern that has to be addressed. So there's a couple different ways we maintain balance in the game, especially between those different dichotomies of high-tech versus low-tech. That's one of the things we found was most difficult to balance. So first of all, everything's based on a points buy system, and of course lower tech, lower powered stuff has fewer points involved than high-tech, high advanced stuff that's hard hitting or really hard to kill. So the points buy system is the best way to balance the whole thing overall. And there's a couple different parts of that. So we have faction and roster creation separated. So faction is where you basically pick out all of your model or all of your available special rules, your technology level, any kind of special things your models can do, and what gear they have access to. That's all determined by a points buy system within faction creation. And then the roster creation is separate from that. Roster creation is where you have a separate pool of points based on the tier level of the game, and so you spend those roster points to add models to your base number of models that you get, and then you add gear and special rules that you unlocked in faction creation at that point as well. So I mentioned model counts. That's another big way we regulate how things are handled as far as the balance goes. So one of the key features of roster creation is roster cores. Roster cores mean that basically what the initial flavor of your roster is going to be within your faction. So you can have cavalry, you can have veterans, you can have conscripts, and a couple other different ones. And those, whatever you choose, will determine your base starting number of bodies, your model count. And then you can add more models by spending points after that. But model count, we found very early on, makes a huge difference in balance. So of course we geared it towards lower tech having more bodies than high tech. So that way it's a good way to balance things out to start with, just right off the top. For more information about faction and roster creation, I'll put links to the video where I specifically give a walkthrough of some of the decisions and records that go into that and how to do it. We've got a whole separate video on that, and I'll put the link up there. Which of course brings us to what's next. What are we planning? How do we plan to distribute the game? And how do we, what do we plan to publish? So first off, we're currently working on getting everything together to print a 2-player starter kit. So this is going to be a big box set. It's going to include a game board, which will be a full 4-foot by 4-foot game surface, complete with punch-out cardstock terrain that builds up into buildings and obstacles to play the game on. It'll also include dice and measuring tools and templates, which are required to play the game. And of course, we're looking at a couple different approaches to putting in models to play with, whether it's cardstock pawns or actual models that'll be manufactured by a couple of the companies I mentioned earlier. So we're looking at putting everything you need to play into a box set at hopefully a reasonably affordable price. We're working on getting our quotes and everything and all of our stuff for manufactured lined up on that now. Of course, this game is very good for players that already have models, already have terrain, already have a game group, especially a diverse game group that plays multiple games. So for that instance, we want to offer just the books. And these will of course be included in the starter kit as well. But the 3 books will be sold as a set, and they will be a core rule book that'll just include the rules. Then there'll be a book specifically for creating factions and rosters that'll be kept separately. That way, when you're playing the game, you don't have to reference a huge tome. You can just grab just the rules and use that. And then, of course, the third book in the set will be some pre-made factions with rosters from each faction. And those will mostly showcase model companies that we've already got sort of an agreement with, such as Anvil Industries, Bombshells, and those that I mentioned earlier. So you'll be able to see some examples of those models painted, built, ready to go, and then some lists based off of those models, as well as a few more generic ones that we may not necessarily have model companies for, but are fairly common tropes in the modeling world. So with that in mind, you'll be able to go two different routes in order to get exactly what you need. If you need the full-on starter kit that has everything you need as a wargamer to get started, or if you're an experienced wargamer or RPG player with miniatures, you just need the rules. To summarize, S.E.E.R is an agnostic miniature skirmish wargame, meaning that it's playable with any miniatures you might have against any miniatures your friends might have across any trope, any kind of genre, any kind of manufacturer. So it's great for existing, experienced players in that regard. At the same time, it's great for beginner players because you can play with any miniatures you want against anything your friends have. So if they have something from an expensive company, you can buy in really cheap and still be able to play. All you need is some cheap models and the rule books. So it's great in that aspect. Also, it includes a lot of wargaming and RPG elements, so it's kind of got a best of both worlds for players who like both. So we're hoping for a prototype of the starter kit and the books, hopefully sometime in Q1 of next year. So around January, February of 2021 is what we're looking at for a prototype and to actually be able to start bringing stuff out. Thank you very much for watching the whole video. Hopefully something you've seen or heard has piqued your interest in S.E.E.R. If you have, be sure to subscribe and like the video, hit the bell notification to see what we're up to next. Next time, I believe we're going to be doing some sort of painting. I'm not sure whether it's going to be a painting competition or since we've got the 3D printer back up and working, we need to circle back and do that. There was also a model swap painting video I'm looking at doing, but that may get pushed back until closer to the end of the month. So be sure to check that out. Also, if you want to keep up with us more regularly, you can check out all of our social media accounts. We have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. The links for all that will be in the description below as well. You can support us at Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. Patreon, we have monthly content for the S.E.E.R. If you want to have access to the playtest rules for S.E.E.R, you can subscribe to our Patreon. You'll get the playtest rules, which are a stripped down version of just the rules. And you'll also get monthly content as far as monthly scenarios, usually with a piece of fiction tied to it that sort of brings in the setting and kind of talks about some of the factions so far. You can also check out Buy Me a Coffee, where, like I said, you can just tip us, buy us cups of coffee here and there, which is always greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for watching again. I'm glad you stuck with it. And remember, at the Clock Tower, it's always game time.